stories, and Tony and I go way back. I do remember that early conversation that he and I had as well. It's amazing how what's happened during this period is people have found their calling, as Steve said. You know, each of us has found a way in which we can give, a way in which we can stand up for what we thought was right. And it fills me with so much pride that, you know, everybody in this room, I'm sure, has found a way to be themselves and stand for what's right and what they know in their heart is what they need to do at this time in history, which I think will go down in the history books as a momentous few years for the West. So the slide set that I have tonight actually is a reasonably academic slide set, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the facts and figures in it. But I want to go through a kind of a brief summary of what we know now and what's in one of my books, well actually both of my books. I do have a few copies of one of them, which appears here, The Great COVID Panic. This came out in 2021, so we started writing it in late 2020. With my co-authors Paul Freiders and Michael Baker. Paul and I had been working on issues related to what turned out to be very important during COVID for about 15 or 20 years prior to the COVID nonsense. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was in such a good position in March 2020 to be able to see what was happening and to feel able to understand it, you know, and master it in some way. There were still surprises for me for sure, but I had more of a roadmap for what was going on because I had been studying power and loyalty and love and social influence and how people behave in groups for 15 or 20 years. It's basically my passion, understanding how people are influenced by their groups. And my goodness, if we didn't understand it before now, boy, we sure do understand a lot more about how people behave in groups and what kind of amazing destructive behavior they can be induced to exhibit when their group is telling them that that's okay.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about what happened and why, and then much more about what to do next. What kinds of things can the resistance movement, or someone suggested at an event last weekend, the restoration movement, put its hands to try to rebuild this country and try to rebuild our communities so that our children have a better life and have a good shot at not repeating the kind of disaster that we have lived through. So the subtitle of my book, The Great COVID Panic, is What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next. So let's start with what happened and why. So first of all, I want to just make a quick point that it wasn't just COVID that led the West off course. There were a lot of things happening before COVID which were very disturbing, and that I had also been studying for a number of years. Not all of these on the list, but certainly a number of them. I was studying inequality. We were seeing rising within-country inequality. We were seeing labor's share of wealth declining. And both of those things were basically elevating an elite class, a kind of ruling class that was further and further separated from the guy on the street, from the rest of us, essentially. And the rest of us were the ones who were laying back and taking our eyes off the ball, basically, and having our barbecues and saying, she'll be right. And the elite class was consolidating its power. And this was happening for many years. So I saw these meetings in Davos, for example. These were happening since 2006 or 7, you know? And this was a very kind of slow process, but it was clearly happening. You could see it in the data. Inequality was going up. And it wasn't just about skill bias, technical change, or any of the other explanations economists give for this. This was a political issue. This was something happening in the halls of power and the dynamics of power. We also already had a health system that was oriented towards getting paying customers to keep paying, rather than actually being oriented towards helping people be healthy, which is kind of what you think that a health system should be about, right? So that was interesting, and I had already had some personal experiences with the failure of Western medicine, but I hadn't really thought so much about it, as of course we all did during COVID. We also had a lot of sin stories floating around already. Now, what is a sin story? Many of us in the room have a Christian background, and so you'll know what sin is supposed to be. You know, you are bad, you have done something wrong, or you are just innately yourself wrong, and you need to be absolved. There is quite a lot of that tenor in many of the different cultural messages that we get now every day. COVID was almost the ultimate sin story. You know, you are not a human being whom I can touch and approach and be a human myself with, but rather a viral vector. You are sinful just by breathing. You could do bad things, right? the anthropogenic climate change story and the notion of what we are all supposed to do in order to supposedly prevent climate change is another one. If you just drive your car outside, you are killing the planet and you're imperiling the lives of our children, right? That's another sin story. Now this is not to say that real health problems and real climate problems don't exist. Of course they do. But the question is it really going to help those things if we make the various kind of self-flagellations that are being called upon, the whole people are being called to do in order to somehow service this, this need for absolution. We also have a problem with sin stories in the woke culture. So, if you are triggered by someone, right, because they say the wrong thing, that means, they are sinning against you. You have to have a safe space. You must not talk on certain topics. It's very dangerous. You don't want to give offense. You don't want to do violence to someone in a verbal sense. These are, again, stories of sin. And what does a story of sin do? Its function is to divide people. It divides people into the good and the bad. The people who are acceptable and the people who are not acceptable. The people with the majority and acceptable views and those with the small fringe minority views. And that's a very scary thing to contemplate, because that thinking, that kind of us-them thinking, as Father Dave said, is how human societies have led to the most destruction that we've seen in the history of the species. And we already also had, before 2020, a very distracted, kind of self-centered, victimhood-promoting culture. Our kids on the phones all the time and, playing the various social media things and Facebook and whatever. I mean, I'm like Steve, I'm not on any of these kinds of platforms because I just don't really want to spend my life that way, but kids were becoming very self-centered and very oriented towards image. And so this was kind of priming everybody. There was a collective amount of stuff happening that made us ripe for the exploiting when COVID came on the scene. And you remember what happened when COVID came on the scene. There was a panic. This is where my book starts, actually, is in the panic of March 2020. And once that panic took hold amongst the population, the politicians had to follow it because they felt they had a political imperative. And we found out in that moment that our politicians in Australia were not courageous, to use, I think, Steve's word or Tony's word. There was no courage there. There was no courage to actually recognize the historical moment for what it was and to step up to the plate. No, it was, I must protect my political career, right? It was a cowardly response. And once that response began to be solidified, it held us to a path, held the politicians to a path that ultimately went down to 3 years from now, from that moment, vaccines and lockdowns and masks and incredible amounts of damage. So we had a crowd that formed when people were so scared, and that was for me the biggest learning of this time. I had not understood what a crowd was because I had never lived through one. Most of us hadn't lived through one. The last crowd that, in the history books that I remember reading about was the 1930s German crowds. Right? But there are also crowds from my country of birth in the US. There was the witch hunts, where people also banded together in this mighty group to denigrate a particular group of people, women who were supposedly possessed by the devil. And that created destruction as well. People were murdered because of that. And we've had the same kind of phenomenon here. So this is not an unknown phenomenon. This is not something that is totally outside the realm of, imagination for the human species. No. Crowds are something we do. And we need to recognize that moving forward if we want to protect our kids from the possibility that this will happen again. And we also, of course, because of the crowds and the political incentive, saw an incredible amount of political propaganda being pushed towards us from the media, who are basically now bought and sold by whoever is the highest bidder. And there was bullying and suppression and defamation and all these things. And yes, I was a victim of this, but I'm fine, right? There were many other people who were so badly defamed and deregistered and basically just ostracized. And they lost their livelihoods, they lost their whole families. And that kind of devastation is going to be with them for the rest of their lives, obviously. And so we just created a horrific, repressive environment. Nothing like the free democratic Australia that I emigrated to 20 years ago. And we now still see the remnants of psychological capture. Right? We know that in a crowd, what happens is people's minds become hijacked by the logic of the crowd. Their mind is no longer actually thinking independently. They're not able to use their mind to independently, critically evaluate facts or data that comes in. What they use their mind for, it's a big mind, it's a big one, so it's very capable. They use it to rationalize whatever the crowd thinks on that day. It's a very Orwellian sort of concept. But that's what we all saw, right? In 2020 and 2021, you would try to have a conversation with somebody on the other side, and you would present this whole ream of facts, right? Well, but this and that, and just think about, have we ever done this? And does this make sense? And it was just, it wouldn't stick. It was like you completely talking at cross purposes. The other person would just come out with assertion after ad hominem after assertion. Right? And this was incredibly frustrating for all of us, of course. I remember wanting to punch the wall several times. Probably would have gone to Father Dave's camp a couple times and gotten a few guys out. But this was the problem, is that the brain in those people was no longer able to actually make sense of data. The brain was literally just tethered to the crowd's narrative. And so those people were not the people we knew anymore in those moments, in a sense. Right? They were still people, but they were captured. And we still see that today. So this is one of the big problems that we have, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So in economics, because I'm an economist, I have to talk about the kinds of things that we saw. We saw increasing market power, which is bad for consumers. Right? Whenever you have more concentration in the market, it's bad. We saw the destruction of links between suppliers and customers, which is bad because it takes a lot of time to reform those links. And that's a really important part of a functioning economy, is those kinds of healthy links between people. And a lockdown basically pushes pause on all those links. And everybody else, who was previously working in those links starts to think about, what else could I do? And we saw what happened at the fall of the Soviet Union when that happened in one instant, in 1990, 1991. All of the links that had existed under communism broke. It took that country 15 years to get back to the level of GDP that it was at in 1989. Right? And the reason is because it takes a lot of time to rebuild. So when the lockdowns first happened, my first thought was, oh no, we don't want to break up all of those productive links because that's going to cost us economically. And of course my second thought was, and then there's also the direct suffering. Now there's also a lot of centralized control and bureaucratic power, and as was mentioned earlier, bureaucrats are not elected officials and they don't really have any authority, but they certainly found themselves with a lot of power, and we know what power is like. We know what power does to people, right? Does everybody remember, right? That power is an aphrodisiac, power is corrupting. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. People will do anything to keep on to power. When they have it, they will do anything. They would rather die than give it up, often. Right? So when you are listening to someone who has a lot of power, particularly one who is newly powerful and obviously very impressed with that, you should treat that person like a hard drug user. That person will do anything, will say anything to stay in power. So be like the Africans. I remember being interviewed by somebody in Africa a few years ago now, I guess it would have been 2 years ago, and she said, it's amazing you Western people are taken in by these messages from your politicians about how it's good for the health of the country and all this sort of stuff. We see through that stuff in a second. Because they remember what it was like to have a colonial, boot on your neck. And then anybody, who was in power was just going to basically try to keep themselves in power. That was all. And all of the rest of the verbiage that would come out of their mouths was just window dressing. We would do well to remember that here in the West. And of course, we've seen erosion of trust in institutions and in one another, unfortunately. And we've also created hugely inflationary conditions. We're seeing a rising cost of living and all of that stuff, plus a huge increase in debt with our children being the recipients of that. So they're going to be paying that off for, as Michael Scott in The Office says, for the rest of their lives. So that is a huge cost as well. So we've done horrific damage. Hopefully it's clear to everybody in this room, Australia's COVID policies didn't have anything to do with health promotion. Once you realize that, a lot of things just become much more obvious. And you stop kind of screaming at the sky, why would you do this? Why wouldn't they do that? Well, because they're not maximizing health. The policies were not aimed to maximize health. That was not the goal. That was not the goal. It was the window dressing. It was the wrapping, right? You know how people say you wrap whatever you want to sell in the flag. In this case, the flag was COVID. If you wrapped it in the flag of COVID, you were a goer, right? You were going to get money, you were going to get influence. And if you didn't, if you resisted, well then, good luck to you. So because the Australian government, just like other Western governments, has not yet come out with a cost-benefit analysis of the lockdown policies that they put in place, I finally decided to write one myself, and this book came out late last year. Do lockdowns and border closures serve the greater good? And I was greatly assisted in this book by Sanjeev Sadlock, whose name may be familiar to some of you, because he was actually a Victorian Treasury economist for a number of years. He was a top Indian civil servants graduate, and came out here, to a free country supposedly, but then parted ways with the Victorian Treasury when they disagreed on COVID, and was able to help me with this book. And in this book, we use a new currency to measure the damage caused by lockdowns, a currency which we can translate to dollars and to existing currencies. It's a very useful one, and I can talk about it at another time if anybody's interested. And we find that, at a minimum, being very generous to lockdowns in terms of how much they might have potentially saved us, the cost of those lockdowns was 68 times their benefits. So that's a pretty big number. So what do we now need? And I want to spend most of my time talking about this, which is hopefully about half the time. So we first, of course, need, and I'm not sure we'll get this, but we do need an admission that the present economic conditions we're facing, and economic conditions to me are visceral, they're real conditions. The cost of living crisis hits people where it hurts. It makes people stressed. It makes children unable to have opportunities that otherwise would. It makes partnerships more stressed. It makes everybody's quality of life worse. Those woes were caused much more by our COVID mismanagement than by the war in Ukraine or climate change or anything else that you care to name. And this is gradually being admitted, actually, even on the mainstream media. So tomorrow, 60 Minutes is going to air a piece about the cost of living, and I'm going to be featured, apparently, I'm told, and it will be connecting the cost of living crisis to the COVID policies that we put in place. We also really need a full and replicable quantification of vaccine damage. We all in this room are aware that there's more damage from the vaccines than is being admitted in the mainstream media, but there are a whole bunch of estimates, a whole range of estimates about how bad the damage is really going to get. And we just don't know, because we don't know the long-term effects of having this mRNA product in the body. But we really could use the government and some other people, like Pfizer, Moderna, whatnot, to actually front up and take a courageous leading role in helping us to figure out what kind of damage has really been done, and then to, of course, try to undo it. We need help for those who are still psychologically blocked, and that's most people. Now, people in this room, you guys have clear consciences, and you probably think, okay, I can at least breathe. I may not be able to spend money on much. I may have lost my job, I may have lost some of my friends, but at least I can sleep at night. Imagine all those people who are starting to wake up and who are going to, if they face the reality, possibly not be able to sleep at all, possibly have the psychological shock of their lives. Right? So those people are going to need our strength, our help, and our compassion. We should not be thinking about this as us versus them. Them is us. Them is most of the Western population. Most of the Western population were taken in by the narrative, the nonsense. And so unless we are aiming to simply not atone, not in any way get back together with those people, which essentially means cutting ourselves off from 80 or 90% of the human race, we need to figure out a way to reach them again. And we need to help them, because they don't have the strength. And they've proven that. We also, I think, need a countrywide acknowledging that this happened, and some confronting by the perpetrators of the victims and by the victims of the perpetrators. And one of the potential mechanisms that I see that could be applicable here is what we saw in South Africa after apartheid with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And those were very powerful, moving kinds of social initiatives that happened in order to try to heal really a broken heart in that country. Again, trying to get over an us-them divide. And this pain has been so broadly felt in the country, a royal commission is barely going to scratch the surface. So we need to have grassroots level committees, justice-seeking bodies, justice protocols, and we are going to have to help create those in a way that will be suitable for Australia. So there is a lot of work ahead for the resistance. Just recognizing what has happened is, you've got your foot in the room, but now that you're in the room, we have to all figure out, what can I do, what part can I play in rebuilding this country, and that is one of the first things that I think we need to work for. So I've been blogging a lot on the Brownstone Institute site. If you haven't seen it, please check it out, brownstone.org. Brownstone Institute was the publisher of my book, The Great COVID Panic. It was founded by the great Jeffrey Tucker, a libertarian thinker in the United States. And this is just a picture of one of the blogs. He always picks these beautiful pictures for our blogs. And so here's some ideas for further steps that we need to take in the resistance together. One is that we need to recognize that the decisions made during COVID were made by the elite on behalf of the elite, not by the people for the people. So we need to figure out how to get the voice of the people back into resource allocation decision making in our machinery of state here in Australia and elsewhere in the West. So for this, one of the innovations that my co-authors and I have suggested is the citizen jury, where just like in criminal trials, everybody in this room, everybody in Australia would sit on a jury, and in expectation that perhaps once in your life you get called up to serve with 20 of your peers to appoint the next, let's say, Minister of Education. The way that's done at the moment is through a whole bunch of political networks and connections, right? So the Minister of Education doesn't have as much of an incentive to represent the interests of the people as he does the interests of the elite. We would like to change that, so we can use the jury system as a way to do that. We also, I think, and there's other direct democracy innovations that we can adopt. We also, I think, need to have a better attitude towards risk. We hear from a firefighter here who's facing risks every day. A lot of the people who resisted the COVID narrative were people who were taking risks every day. They were people working with their hands, people who were in reasonably dangerous trades, because they could see that compared to what they normally faced, even compared to getting in a car and driving to work every day, COVID was not such a big deal. And besides which, there were things we could do, all right? And we just weren't being told about them by the government. So we need to have a bit more of an accepting attitude towards risk. Life is about risk. If you don't have a bit of risk in your life, then what is the point of living at all? You can't do many things. You're just going to cower under your bed for your whole life and be safe, right? That is not a fun life. That is not what our ancestors fought for. That is not what the West is about. That's not what the Enlightenment supports. So we need to stop thinking that way, and we need to accept there is risk, not just because of the way the world is, but because of the way people are. People are fallible. Sometimes people make mistakes. Lawyers make mistakes, doctors make mistakes, economists make mistakes. Everybody does.